Good afternoon and welcome to the Schieffer Series. This is our first Schieffer Series since the beginning of the pandemic, and we're thrilled to have all of you with us, those of you who are here in the audience and those of you who are watching from home or your offices. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I'd like to thank our amazing sponsor of so many years, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, who without this wouldn't be possible. Thank you to SNF and all that they do for us. I'd also like to thank the TCU Schieffer College of Communication. The TCU Schieffer College of Communication is a very special place to us, and we are thrilled for this partnership that we've had going for so many years. Now, before the best name in news, Bob Schieffer, takes over, we'd like to show you a short video that will tell you a little bit about what we're going to be discussing today. So let's go to the video.
In September, a new trilateral security pact between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom was announced. The deal, known as AUKUS, sends a clear message that China's aggression in the Indo-Pacific will not go unchallenged. AUKUS will involve modernizing military capabilities, enhancing readiness, and developing critical technologies. But what makes AUKUS a game changer is that it will provide Australia with its first nuclear-powered submarines. These 8 subs will significantly expand Australia's naval power in the region. But only a few countries in the world currently have nuclear-powered submarines. And adding Australia to this list was a big decision that France, a vital U.S. ally, was left out of. AUKUS also required Australia to sideline a multi-billion-dollar deal with France that would have provided Canberra with conventional subs. France's foreign minister called the move a stab in the back, and President Macron went as far as temporarily recalling France's ambassadors to the U.S. and Australia. While President Biden has worked to repair the relationship, AUKUS coming so soon after the U.S.'s unilateral decision to withdraw from Afghanistan has many allies seeing a worrying pattern in Washington's decision-making. In this episode of the Schieffer Series, our panel of experts will unpack why AUKUS reshapes the strategic landscape of the Indo-Pacific, how allies are reacting to another instance of unpredictable U.S. diplomacy, and what the U.S. can do to restore trust among its allies and partners during this time of global insecurity. This is the Schieffer Series. Let's dive in.
And good afternoon, everyone. Here we are coming finally out of hibernation from COVID, and it's a real pleasure. I've missed everybody here at CSIS and really looking forward to this today. This is a fascinating subject that we've chosen to talk about today. And as is always the case, we have three people who know a lot more about it than I do. So I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we'll get right to it. Heather Conley is the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic, Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia Program at CSIS. She was the Executive Director of the Office of the Chairman of the Board for the American National Red Cross, 2005 to 2009, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, 2001 to 2005. Michael J. Green is the Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS, Director of Asian Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and was the Director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, 2001 to 2005, and then Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia. And finally, Tom Schieffer is the former U.S. Ambassador to Australia, 2001 to 2005, and the former U.S. Ambassador to Japan from 2005 to 2009. Ambassador Schieffer founded and remains active in Envoy International, which is largely a firm that does consulting work on international affairs for clients on both sides of the Pacific. And I will reveal, because we have no secrets here, he also happens to be my little brother. So we're happy to have him here today. Gentlemen and ladies, I thought it would be nice. This is the week that saw the passing of a great American, Colin Powell. And I wondered if each of you might have, because I think all four of us, it turns out, have links to Colin Powell in four very different ways. So tell us a story about Colin Powell. Mike, start with you.
Well, I had the opportunity to travel with Secretary Powell, to be in meetings with him for a couple of years. I was the senior official on Asia at the NSC, so I traveled with him to Pakistan, China, Japan, Korea. More than any leader I've seen in government, he was focused on the welfare of his troops, the diplomats, the Marine Guards in the embassies, the people traveling with on the plane. The story, and there are many, that occurred to me when you asked was in 2003 when he was meeting with Jiang Zemin of China, trying to convince the Chinese side to host the six-party talks to get some pressure on North Korea. And the Chinese didn't want to do it. And Jiang Zemin kept saying, China's not involved, you do it, China's not involved. So finally Secretary Powell said, look, you can work with me on this diplomatic solution, or if you'd like, I can hand this to Don Rumsfeld. And Jiang Zemin said in about a nanosecond, you. And that afternoon, the Chinese side agreed to do the six-party talk. So Secretary Powell had a good sense of humor, and he took advantage of some of the little friction we had in the administration for the American interest.
I believe that.
Absolutely. Well, and our heartfelt sympathy goes to Mrs. Powell and the family. Our country lost an incredible statesman and a soldier, and they lost a husband and a father. So our hearts go out to them for sure this week. I think in some ways, as we're so sad about Secretary Powell's passing, we've really had an opportunity to think about our favorite moments. My favorite moment was when I sat in on a meeting that Secretary Powell had with then Swedish Foreign Minister Anna Lindh, who tragically was murdered several months later. But in the meeting, she brought to Secretary Powell a whole CD collection of ABBA, which he loves. You know, if he loves his Volvos and he loves ABBA. So as he got this big grin on his face, and then he began to sing to Minister Lint, "Mamma Mia," and it was a wonderful. He has a very good voice, wonderful moment. But just to echo Mike. One of my colleagues, I thought, said it so beautifully, that while the Secretary of State is the principal diplomatic advisor to the President, Secretary Powell was the leader of the State Department. And he instilled in us the value of that leadership, core mission, and I think we all felt incredibly blessed and privileged to be part of the Powell State Department team, of which I was. So it's just a thousand memories of swearing in ceremonies. Maybe, Tom, you'd like to talk about your swearing in. He always insisted on being at the swearing in ceremonies because he wanted to see the children, the spouses, the partners, the mothers and fathers, the cousins of the person that was about to be sworn in, because it's because of you. You're the family, and you're going out with, we may call, the ambassador, but we know this is a family, and you're part of the State Department family. So
I think that's so interesting because we've had many secretaries of state down through the years, some good, some bad, some in the middle. But we've had not nearly so many leaders of the State Department, and he certainly was that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Heather. Tom?
Yeah, what Heather's referring to is I was confirmed by the Senate at 3:30 and took a plane at 6 o'clock to attend the OSMIN conference in Australia. And Secretary Powell had actually gone to Beijing first, and he brought the papers for me to give to the Australian government that announced that I was the ambassador there. But when I think of Colin Powell, he was a person of great character and decency. And the people who worked for him loved him in a way that I have never really seen in any other place. And he achieved great celebrity in his life, but he never got celebrity confused with leadership. And to him, leadership was always about taking care of the troops. And the people that worked for him thought that he was an extraordinary person because they understood that he respected and appreciated the work that they did. And he achieved success wherever he went because of that. And I think that there are really two secretaries of state that are held in special regard by people at the State Department. The first one was George Shultz, and the Foreign Service Institute was eventually named after him. And the other one is Colin Powell. And I think more than anything else, it was a sense of respect and a communication to people that the work that they were doing, whatever it was vital to the overall mission of the department. And they took pride in that, as they should. And I think that Colin Powell's example is something that would behoove all of us to try to follow in our lives.
And there is no small thing to talk about the difference in celebrity and the difference in leadership.
Yeah.
And Colin Powell was the latter.
Yeah.
He truly was a leader. And I had the great honor and luck to interview Colin Powell 26 times on Face the Nation. Maybe more than anybody else interviewed him, I don't know. But 26 times he appeared on Face the Nation. And perhaps those who book Sunday talk shows will more appreciate this than people who just turn on the television and watch it. The hoops you have to jump through to make sure you get them when you want to. Generally, people that you don't need on the Sunday talk show are the people who are pestering you to be on the Sunday talk show. We were always glad to see Colin Powell, but the thing of all those Sundays that I spent with Colin Powell that I always remember, we would often have students, high school students, sometimes college students, to come and be guests on the show, and they'd come from everywhere, and they were backstage. And so one Sunday, General Powell was there, and at the end of our interview, and he didn't know these kids were there, I said, General, can I ask you something? I always called him General, even after he was Secretary of State. I said, General, can I ask you something? I said, we've got all these kids backstage here. Would you have a moment to just hang around for a second and say hi to them? I said, they would be thrilled to death. And he said, well, of course I would. Colin Powell sat there for a half hour and talked to those kids. These were not, nobody was going to know about this. Nobody was going to put it in the paper. He just sat there and enjoyed it, which I thought made it even more important and more meaningful to all of them. Colin Powell always had the time to take care of a good cause, the time to be nice to people that nobody else was being nice to. He always took the time to express interest in those around him, and I think that's one of the reasons that he will truly be remembered. He'll be remembered for many accomplishments and so forth, but I think that's, to me, I think that's the part I'd like to be remembered for, is the kind of kindness that Colin Powell showed. So on that, Mike, I don't think most Americans knew what AUKUS was until that story comes out on television about we're going to give some submarines or work with the Australians to develop some nuclear submarines, and then you got that bombast from the French government that followed it. Tell us exactly what AUKUS is and why AUKUS. What is it there for, and what do we hope to accomplish?
Well, it stands for Australia, UK, US. So the US, Britain, Australia. It's not a treaty per se. It's an agreement. A pact, and it was initiated by Australia because the Australians over the past few years have increasingly worried about their strategic environment. They've seen the Chinese try to build submarine bases in Vanuatu and the Pacific, South Pacific near them. They've seen the Chinese embargo Australian coal pressure them over a list of complaints, and they weren't going to back down. They've seen the general power projection of the Chinese military beyond the first island chain, which is Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines, to the second island chain, which is Guam, American territory, and into the Pacific. So they were alarmed. They had an agreement with France, with the Navy group, to build submarines. And the French and Australian version of this differs, but the Australian version is the French submarines were not on time, they weren't to spec, and the Chinese threat was getting bigger. They needed something new. So they brought this to the US. The Biden administration, looking at the same theater and the same problem, wanted, I think, to do two things, really. They wanted capability. They wanted our allies, our close allies, to have the ability to hold Chinese forces at bay. And they wanted to signal to China the consequences of Chinese coercion. And this was a big deal. I think for Britain, it was about global Britain, and Heather can talk more about this. And it is a big deal. Most people who work on the Pacific and are worried about China think this is terrific, because if you're a soccer fan, the Australians were looking at defending their own goal over the next 20 to 30 years. Now they're going to go and make the Chinese worry about their goal. It's going to backfoot a very ambitious and aggressive PLA. It's going to be technologically complicated. We haven't transferred this nuclear, these are not nuclear missile or nuclear weapon submarines, it's nuclear power, but we haven't given that to anyone except Britain, and not since the 1950s. And Australia has one small isotope reactor. So it's a big lift, but they're serious. And there's bipartisan, I think Tom will tell you, there's bipartisan support for it. And the last thing I'd say is, Heather will tell you about the Europe problem, because to deal with China, we need Europe. So there's been a bit of collateral damage we should talk about. But the other thing this really shows is how Xi Jinping and China have made enemies. I think Tom would agree, a decade ago, they could have had Australia and Britain. Relations were good. Mm-hmm. But bullying proud democracies like Australia and the United Kingdom is not smart. And what this also tells us is Xi Jinping is making powerful enemies with his, frankly, bullying of states like Australia and Britain.
I definitely want to get Tom's reaction to that. But let me go first to Heather, because you're kind of our Europe watcher at CSIS.
I try. Try to keep up.
What in the world I mean, I've never seen a reaction like this from one of our allies. I mean, there were charges of we've stabbed France in the back, all this kind of stuff. I mean, kind of untangle this for us. What's happened here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to go back a little bit to, President Biden's, focus that, our foreign policy is going to be allied-centric, that America's back, that we're going to work closely with our allies. We're not going to view, particularly our European allies, as foes, but as true partners as we work together towards the great challenges of the day, whether that's in the Indo-Pacific or in the Middle East. So I think this, in that backdrop and that promise, we've had a really, shaken 8 weeks, 9 weeks, 10 weeks with the Afghanistan withdrawal, which deeply shook our European partners in particular. The Biden administration kept assuring, everyone that they were consulting our allies, but it felt like they were informing them of decisions reached in Washington, of which then the European allies had to make adjustments, not truly consulting them. And of course, their security is very much part and parcel of decisions that are reached here in Washington. So sort of in that backdrop where we had this surprise. And the anger, French anger, is based on the surprise. Secretary Blinken was in Paris just 2 months ahead of this announcement, said nothing. The French had a big major strategic dialogue with their Australian counterparts I want to say 2 to 3 weeks before this decision was announced. Nothing was said. And so you can, on the one hand, say, we are really going to work very closely and hard with our allies and yet not tell them of a major decision which affects them. There are 66 billion reasons why France was upset. This was a major procurement for them, and around that procurement was their strategy. France was the first European partner that articulated an Indo-Pacific strategy because they have citizens and equities and interests in the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific, and none of that was taken into account. And it seemed to me that the White House was shocked, that France was shocked at being surprised, and France wanted to get our attention. So they did something for the first time in our diplomatic history. They temporarily withdrew their ambassador. And 7 days later, Presidents Biden and Macron spoke. The White House had to issue an apology. Basically, that's what the statement was. I apologize for surprising you. And now we're in the process of digging out of the hole we dug, which we hope, we believe President Macron and President Biden will speak this week as a prelude to their meeting on the margins of the G20 in Rome at the end of this month, where out of this crisis, we hope will come an opportunity for repositioning. But again, this surprise, saying we're consulting, but we're really not consulting. The allies have now watched this behavior, and they're now starting to wonder, is this just accident from a new administration that doesn't have a lot of appointees there and they're struggling with all of these challenges? Or is this the approach that this administration is going to take with our allies? And I think that's the question mark. Mike is right. London was sort of basking in AUKUS in some ways, getting over the UK's very deep anger at the Afghanistan withdrawal. And if you would have heard the voices out of the House of Commons after that betrayal was as bad as the stab in the back that the French just said. AUKUS sort of smoothed those ruffled feathers over. But we need to really make sure our strategy with our allies is tight and deeply invested and not keep surprising it. Or what we're going to do is not deal with the strategic advantage that Mike is suggesting. We're just dealing with the blowback and the collateral damage with our allies and partners. So have to be really careful.
So, Tom, let's focus on Australia. Was it Australia's idea or the United States' idea to do this? Do we know?
Well, Mike probably has better sources on that than I do, but he said it was Australia's idea. I think the truth of the matter is I was very surprised by it because I never thought the Australians had the capacity to buy the nuclear submarines because they're quite expensive. But I thought it was a great deal. I think it's the biggest deal with Australia, and since the concept of the Five Eyes, when Australia joined the UK and Canada and New Zealand and the United States.
The Five Eyes, tell us.
The Five Eyes are the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, who share all their intelligence. And that is a huge thing. It's a huge part of what you do when you're in Australia, is managing that relationship. But I think that this agreement, the AUKUS agreement, is the biggest thing that has happened since that. So this is not a small thing at all. And, you know, I appreciate what Heather is saying, and I think it's certainly true. But sometimes my experience in government has been that governments always don't do things intentionally. When they happen, people question whether it was intentional or whether it was accidental. A lot of stuff just doesn't go right. And I would guess that if the Biden administration had it to do over again, they would present it to the French in a different manner. Having said that, there is a huge economic issue involved here because of $66 billion that was lost by the French and their defense industry and their employment and all those kind of things. So those are difficult conversations to have and to keep it quiet. And I'm sure that the idea was for Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to present it to the world at once. And there was nothing close to a leak about it. But I think it had an impact because it needs to have an impact. This was not an inconsequential thing. And I think that a lot of people don't appreciate the difference between the capacity that a nuclear submarine has versus a conventional submarine. A conventional submarine has to surface. And whenever a submarine surfaces, 3 years. Well,
Really?
Yeah, really. And the other part of it is that I think people don't often appreciate is how far Australia is from everywhere else. It's about a 10-hour flight from Beijing to Sydney. It's to Tokyo. I'll get my geography right here. From Tokyo to Japan, and it's Beijing's the same. It's about 10 hours. From Tokyo to Seattle, it's about 9.5 hours. So even though Australia is on that side of the world, it's a long way away from China. But the ability for a submarine to go underwater all the way up to close by China is a lot different for a nuclear-powered submarine than it is for a conventional submarine, and that's a huge strategic difference. And what we're talking about here is the Australians buying 8 nuclear-powered submarines, and the United States is talking about building 9 new nuclear-powered submarines. Well, when you think about that, now you're talking about 17 of the most strategic assets that we have in the world. Now, the American submarines are not all going to be in the Pacific, but having said that, you've really affected the ability of the United States to deter Chinese aggression. And I think that's very important. And I think bringing the United Kingdom into it was a surprise to me, but I think it was also a great thing to do because it brings the UK, I think, in a better place in the Pacific as well. And if you look at it from the United Kingdom standpoint, what has happened in Hong Kong has to be haunting to the British because the agreement that they had to turn over Hong Kong to the Chinese has been trashed. And I think the British are saying, is this the start of something new? And with regard to the Australians themselves, they don't like being squeezed by the Chinese because they supply a lot of the raw materials for Chinese expansion. I was in Australia when the first Chinese deal was done for iron ore, and it was about a $10 billion deal. And everybody said, whoa, that's a big deal. The next year, it was $25 billion more. And then the year after that, the Chinese started visiting with the foreign ministry and the foreign minister and the prime minister, and their message was pretty simple. Do you really have to be this close to the United States? And John Howard didn't use these words. He was the prime minister at the time, but in effect, he basically said to the Chinese, I thought you wanted to buy these minerals. And it stopped. And I think as sophisticated as foreign policy is, sometimes I think the Chinese understand you can't go any further. And until they understand that you can't go any further, they'll try. And I think I would guess that this was a big wake-up call in Beijing. I would also, and I don't advise the Chinese government on what they should do, but in trying to leverage the Australians and trying to squeeze the Australians, there was tension that was created, and the Chinese spokesman at one point in time said, look, Australia is like the gum on China's shoe. Well, I don't believe I'd ever tell an Australian something like that, because they are one tough people, and they don't like to be leveraged, and they don't like to be squeezed. So I think this is all the result of all the things that have been going on for a number of years.
Let me ask you just quickly, because Heather just touched on this. The fact that this got announced in the way that it did, this came after our, for want of a better word, clumsy withdrawal from Afghanistan. Do you think announcing this had anything to do with Afghanistan?
Well, I think the process of doing this was long term. I mean, this had obviously been talked about and was such a sophisticated answer and change in policy. But there's no question that Afghanistan really bothered a lot of people. And it wasn't just in Europe, it was in Asia.
Well, you saw it in the Australian press.
Yes, the Australian press, Paul Kelly, who is kind of the preeminent journalist in Australia, wrote a column that was very disturbing to me. Mike and I talked about it, in which 4 prime ministers, John Howard was one of them, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, and Tony Abbott. So it was 2 prime ministers from each side of the political equation, all said that Australia had to think about its relationship with the United States. Well, that's not what you want an ally to
and
be
not
worried
what you would expect to hear from Australia.
No, and Americans don't ever expect to hear it from Australia. But there was a similar anxiety that was expressed in the Japanese press about the same situation. And I think this was such a strong message in so many capitals in Asia, and it was so well received. It was well received in Australia, it was well received in India, it was well received in a lot of places, because what it indicated was the United States is in it for the long term, and the United States can be depended upon. And it gave Australia capacity to help in that it hadn't had before.
Mike, tell us about Japan. How did this go down there?
Oh, anybody who is any state that's in the front line with China, and that includes Japan. I mean, the Japanese, when Tom was in Tokyo and I was in the White House, the Japanese Navy was bigger than China's Navy. Yeah. Now China's Navy is not that much, 15 years later, Chinese Navy is twice as big plus some. And that doesn't even include the Chinese Coast Guard, the fishery police and militia. And they are swarming the Sea of Japan. They are circumnavigating Japan. They're doing exercises simultaneously in the East China Sea and the Pacific Ocean, just flooding the zone. The Japanese are thrilled. India is seeing more and more, PLA presence in the Indian Ocean. They're thrilled. A lot of countries that are officially expressing concern or urging caution, like Indonesia, are privately thrilled because they're worried about what they're seeing the Chinese Navy do. So in Asia, this is playing generally really well, except of course for China. And to Tom's point, I think the Chinese got a bit of a shock here because this combination of nuclear-powered submarines under the water gives us an advantage in undersea warfare that's generational ahead of the Chinese, and really just puts a great big stop sign to the idea that the PLA is going to be able to range freely across the Pacific. I think it would be unrealistic to have expected the US, Australia, and Britain to give the French side a heads up. I'm certain Paris would have immediately gone to the press and tried to sabotage it. They were trying to get it done. So I don't think it's realistic to have said, you should have told the French side before you announced it. However, to your question, Bob, I do sense that there was a certain urgency to this because of Afghanistan. They needed to get points on the scoreboard quick. And the argument for getting out of Afghanistan was in part to focus on Asia. And I think the White House wanted to get some points on the board to say, we're doing that. So not realistic to expect a negotiation with France. Australia's going to pay, a couple $100 million in fines, and they knew it. But the way they rolled it out was not well thought through, the way it was presented, the timing, a lot of it was a little too urgent, almost desperate. And the collateral damage was going to be there, but probably worse than it could have been, because I suspect because of what you're saying, Bob, that they were looking to get points on the scoreboard after Afghanistan.
Heather, I want to get back to our European allies. France was not the only one that was upset by this. I mean, we'd already begun to see what the Germans were saying. The Americans want to confront China. We want to engage China. The French were saying, it made no question. All because, I think, kind of floating around behind all this is the idea the United States pivot to the Pacific. What is obviously the Germans and the French have a different idea about that than perhaps we do, but talk about that a little bit.
Well, absolutely, and part of the collateral damage, again, accidentally, but it just made it worse. The day that we announced AUKUS was the same day that the European Union unveiled its new Indo-Pacific strategy, and it just, we ran right over that one. In part, we are going to have success if Europe is with us on our policies towards the Indo-Pacific. And you're absolutely right, Bob. There's been great evolution of thinking, and I think we do have to acknowledge that. But European Union policy straddles the gamut with China. It is a partner, it is a competitor, it is a systemic rival. It's all of those things, and it depends on your perspective. You may see China more as partner than systemic rival. We don't have a unified European policy. So you see where you have, for instance, Lithuania, seeking and having a Taiwan representative office and getting enormous pressure from Beijing, making sure that, that wasn't necessarily organized well within the EU. You do have a German approach, which is evolving, but just even a few days ago, Chancellor Merkel, in her caretaker capacity, was hoping to revitalize the European Union's comprehensive agreement on investment with China, which was in some ways a legacy for her of 16 years of German investment in the Sino-German relationship. And now you have, of course, France, which I noted actually does have a broader strategy in mind for the Indo-Pacific. The Europeans know we've been pivoting for over a decade. They understand that, but they don't understand our decision-making processes, how much we will commit to Europe, how much we have to sort of reposition ourselves to the Indo-Pacific, what they're responsible for, what we are going to stay and do, and that's very much symbolic of the Afghanistan withdrawal. What I worry about as part of the collateral damage is that there is a perspective from Paris that, using sort of some of Mike's muscular language, that the US is preparing for confrontation, military confrontation with China. And the Europeans have not signed up for the so-called new Cold War with China. They want to be left out of it, thank you very much. They'd like to continue to trade. They'll support us on the values equation, but don't get us caught into this. And we can't allow that to start seeping into the dialogue. And so we really do have to double down on consultation very much because of the diplomatic rupture here. There's now a new EU dialogue on the Indo-Pacific, the region as a whole, in addition to the US-EU dialogue on China that was announced under the Trump administration. Again, we're having all these dialogues, but I fear that if we don't manage Europe correctly, our strategy towards the Indo-Pacific will be weaker, economically as well as militarily. Also, we're heading towards a new a NATO summit next year where a new updated strategic concept will be presented. The U.S. wants a strong China component, and we have to have the French on board for that. And if we haven't worked this out, we're going to lose, I think, a valuable strategic document with NATO focusing more on China. So we have to focus on this. It's not enough that we have this great partnership. We have to make sure all our partners and allies are there, or they're going to work against us, and we don't want that to happen.
So what about Taiwan? I've just asked the three of you. Is China going to move on Taiwan? What is the thinking here?
My concern, and I want to say something about what Heather said before I address that. I think we have to have strong alliances in Europe, and NATO is a foundation of our European policy. But I think there is a concern that the United States pivot to Asia means, well, the United States is going to pick up and leave and go to Asia. The United States is the only superpower in the world right now. It can be in both places. Now, there's going to be a second superpower at some point in time in the future, which is China. And I think that all of us would be better off if we began to consider the United States as being needed around the world, not just in Europe. And I would hate for Europeans to come to the conclusion that somehow they're second fiddle to the United States now because of our interest in Asia. We've always been interested in Asia, and we've always had equities in Asia. Not always, but certainly since the end of the war. And sometimes they've been greater than our European allies. But we can't just always look to Europe first and then go to other places in the world. Other places in the world need us in a strong position there too. And now I need to answer, Taiwan. I think it would be hard to argue that Taiwan is not under greater threat now than it was because of what Mike had said earlier, the Chinese ability to try to move their defense perimeter out. And I think the long-term strategy on China is not that hard to understand. It's to make the United States have to consider fighting through that first chain of islands before they get to the Asian continent, and to present the United States president at some time in the future. And you'd have to begin to think that Xi Jinping wants that future to be in his lifetime, that he presents to the United States the quandary of, okay, we're ready to move on Taiwan, and is it really worth a war for you to do that? Well, no, you don't want any president to be put in that position. And I think that this whole AUKUS thing is an effort to draw that attention to that and to defuse Taiwan. I remember President Bush told me once, Jiang Zemin was talking to him about why we needed to sell all these weapons to Taiwan. And President Bush's reply to him was, well, if you'd stop putting all those missiles right across the Taiwan Strait from them, we wouldn't have to sell all this equipment to them. And the conversation didn't last much after that. But that's an old conversation, and this is another iteration of it, in my judgment.
I mean, the Taiwan problem is part of what fueled AUKUS, because if you talk to any leader in Tokyo, Canberra, and especially Taipei, and I think the consensus here in Washington is, while still unlikely, the possibility that China will use force against Taiwan is going up. And you can see it in a bunch of ways. The 4 artificial islands that the Chinese side built in the South China Sea and then militarized, turned them into aircraft carriers, basically. The huge military exercises they're doing, 150 bombers and fighters right around Taiwan. You know, if China did use force against Taiwan, that would be pretty almost existential for Japan and Australia. 60% of global shipping goes through the South China Sea, through that area. It's Japan's vital lifelines. It's Australia's vital lifelines. So part of the problem we have managing our Asian alliances and our European alliances at the same time, it's kind of like, you know, that quip, when the chicken looks at the breakfast menu, it has an interest in what's for breakfast. When the pig looks at the breakfast menu, it has a vital interest. And Japan and Taiwan and India and Australia right now are the pigs. And this is existential. I think for Europe, they're a little more, chicken's probably not the right word to use, but it's not as existential. And there is a clarity of purpose in US, it doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Biden, a clarity of purpose and a clarity of the challenge in our discussions with our Asian allies that's not there with Europe right now. I mean, Europe is trending in the same direction, for sure. France has real challenges from China. France has the largest EEZ, exclusive economic zone, in the South Pacific because of the legacy of the 19th century. And China's encroaching on that too. So I think overall, with some exceptions, Europe is trending in our direction, but there's not the same urgency and almost existential sense that we need to do something. And that means even though we're trending in the same way, increasingly our alliances are diverging a bit, which as a global superpower, we should be able to manage. That's why we get paid the big bucks.
Yeah. So the other word that comes along when AUKUS comes along is the Quad, which is connected to this. Not the squad up on Capitol Hill, but the Quad. Heather, explain to us what that is.
Well, the Quad
You and Michael wrote a paper on that, did you not?
We did. The Quad is maritime democracies, which include the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. And speaking of alliance, when I think of Quad, I'm thinking of a European Quad, which is the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the U.S. So I think our transatlantic Quad and our Pacific Quad. But this is really, Bob, it's a flexible multilateralism of like-minded democracies working together against a common challenge, and that is China. This is the future. This is where we see, the G7 and what we call the D10, the Democracy 10, which is sort of the G7 and the Quad coming together. But these are all very confusing names and geographies, but that's the goal. It's bringing the like-mindeds together to work towards this common challenge. I think it's, again, we see where the White House has not only one of their first virtual summits, one of their first in-person summits. The White House is certainly making a down payment and investing in the Quad as a very important tool. It's challenging because of India. Mike and Tom can talk about that a little bit more. But again, how do we bring in our European allies to engage more meaningfully? Again, this is where the real difficulties of this rollout or lack of rollout. The French have a strong relationship with India. They have, as Mike was saying, deep equities. In fact, there's a referendum you should watch, if we believe it's going to be held on December the 12th, for New Caledonia, which is in the French archipelago, very close to Australia. If independence comes, this New Caledonia will be very susceptible to Chinese influence. That's a strategic issue. That's why doing it the way we did it backfires on us if we don't get this right. So let's hopefully after President Biden meets with President Macron, of which the Indo-Pacific and getting that, resetting U.S.-French strategy towards the Indo-Pacific, hopefully that will be able to bring new opportunities and engaging, again, bringing Europe in together with the Quad. If I've missed anything on the Quad,
I think that's it.
a little out of my orbit.
The reason that, not just this administration, but the Quad was started in the Bush administration, and then the Trump administration elevated it to a foreign ministers meeting, and then Biden brought it up to a summit. The reason the U.S. and our allies in Asia do these pickup games, the Quad, AUKUS, the U.S., Japan, Australia trilateral security dialogue, is because our alliances are all bilateral treaties in Asia. We don't have a NATO in Asia, and we can't make one. NATO was made because nobody was trading with Russia, but our allies are all trading with China, as are we. So nobody wants that kind of NATO in Asia. So that's part of what's happening here and why it's a little clumsy sometimes, because in Asia, it's a series of pickup games to start expanding cooperation on security and technology. I think the U.S.-France relationship is going to recover. The main thing France is doing in diplomatic terms is strengthening its security cooperation with Japan and India. I'm all for that. That's in U.S. interests. That's in Japan's interests, India's interests. The challenges from China to France's interests in the Pacific are considerable. Some artful diplomacy won't necessarily make the anger and the frustration completely go away, but our interests align.
Yeah.
France's interests in geopolitical and security terms do not align with China. So, the step for Blinken and company now is to get us back to that focus on our overlapping interests.
Well, much as we have to heal the U.S.-French relationship, we need the French-Australian relationship to be healed. We need London and Paris, on a variety of levels, to heal that. That's part of it as well. We can't just be the only leg in that three-legged stool as well. It's really important to get this back on track.
I think that's true, but I think it's also true that the United States and France need to reflect on the past history. The French are our oldest ally. But for the French fleet, the British would have been able to evacuate their troops from Yorktown. I think you could make the argument that but for France, the United States wouldn't exist as it does today. And I think you could also argue at the same time that France wouldn't exist as it does today, but for the fact that the American troops died on the Normandy beaches. Those are serious things that are part of our history, both of our histories. And we both need to remember that. And the interests of the French and the United States are the same, although they may not be exactly fitting together right now. But we can't let economics intrude into security without taking more risk in security. And I was also in Australia when these big buys were made. And I remember going to BHP, which is a big energy company, always had an annual dinner. In the first couple of years, I was sitting right next to the CEO from BHP, who was a guy from Houston, an American, and he was the CEO of BHP. About the third or fourth year, Fu Ying, who was the ambassador from China to Australia, was sitting next to the CEO, same CEO. Now, I don't think I'd said anything or I'd used the wrong fork before or whatever, but I did take note that all of a sudden I'm no longer sitting to the right. And there was a sense in the business community, in much of the business community in Australia, that there's a lot of money here involved and we want to be able to take advantage of it. But the Australians are further along in that process than the French or the Germans may be, because they got squeezed. And I think that I don't think we have to confront China. I don't think we have to have a Cold War with China, but I think we need to define the rules of the road here. And if you're going to be involved in the economic side of things, that doesn't give you license to change the security arrangement. And the Quad, I think, was first thought of by Prime Minister Abe in his first term as Prime Minister. And his idea was that there is a basic difference between a democracy and an autocracy. And you should get the great democracies in Asia together and reinforce the values of democracy, not at the detriment to China, but to be sure that they're all saying the same thing at the same time. And we found it at that point in time. I think Condoleezza Rice was concerned about offending China. John Howard in Australia was ready to go forward on the Quad, and the Indians were still trying to decide whether they were a realigned power or were afraid to be aligned. But I think the Indians have come around to the proposition that the four democracies sitting down together have more to achieve than to lose, and it would help in everybody's relationship with the Chinese.
Let me ask you, what is the relationship today between Russia and China? I mean, are we on the verge of another Sino-Soviet bloc? I mean, whoever would like to answer that.
Well, Bob, we've actually tried to study and understand this, I would call it a growing alignment. I think sometimes we either portray it as being too much of a new condominium, or we downplay it as a marriage of convenience. And I think truth, as always, sort of lies in the middle. I don't think it's not accidental that we just saw last week and the last few days Russian military exercises in the Sea of Japan as the U.S. was exercising. We continue to see, I think Xi Jinping shows Vladimir Putin a lot of respect, something that he certainly craves. But China also does not provide as much funding as I think Russia would like, and its energy fields, whether that's Arctic development or energy markets per se. It's a strategically uncomfortable relationship, but right now, I think Moscow sees that there are greater benefits in joining with Beijing and seeing where they can frustrate U.S. interests and objectives, but that there's not going to be an alliance. It's going to be an alignment from time to time, but it's something we do have to watch, particularly Sino-Russian military activities, engagement, exercising, arms transfers. That has, that can challenge not only U.S. military capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, but sort of as Mike said, the worst case scenario is we have both powers deciding to make moves, troop buildups along NATO's flank, seeing where there'd be activity across the Taiwan Straits, and then you would really have a challenge in Washington. Which one do you think is going to go? How do you posture yourself? Would that happen simultaneously? That would be the strategic nightmare, I think, for Washington. But this is a relationship we need to study more. We need to understand how the Chinese strategic community thinks about the Russian relationship, how the Russian strategic community thinks about it. And then this is why the like-mindeds are really important. We need our allies on side.
So the Beijing and Moscow are increasingly cooperating in how they mess with us and undermine our alliances and so forth. But unlike our alliances, if notionally Moscow got in a fight with NATO or China got in a fight with U.S. alliances, they wouldn't help each other. They'd sit back. Whereas our alliances, most of them would come together. So it's not that level of trust. And the other thing is, there are about 5 million Russians in the Far East? There are 1.4 billion Chinese. The same Chinese textbooks and movies that say Okinawa used to be part of China, Korea used to be part of China, also say Vladivostok not too long ago used to be part of China. The Russians are reading those things too. I think, at some level, the Russians have to worry about China in a way that India and Japan, Australia and Europe don't have to worry about us. So that's going to limit it. But they are definitely doing more together.
And I think there's one thing to add to that too, and that's China's regard for Russia as a provider of energy. It's my opinion that the Chinese would be reluctant to be dependent on Russia for too much of their energy needs. I think they'd rather go to places like the Middle East and in Africa, and that's why they spend more time and effort in that, because it's the longest common border in the world. And it has not been a common border that has always things have gone well. And it's a lot of open space to the north with a lot of people to the south. And that has to hit home on people in both capitals. But right now, I agree with both Heather and Mike that there's kind of a bad boys club that gets together and talks about things that we can do to poke people in the eye without necessarily just getting caught at doing it. And I think that's a lot of what's worked. But I think it is interesting that both Russia and China, which are, I would think, the most critical threats to the United States in the world right now, really don't have a lot of allies. But we do. And we should never forget that, because allies are force multipliers, not only on security, but on economic issues. And we can't neglect one set of allies for the benefit of the other. It has to be a mutual thing that has to be done at the same time. And we can do that. And we're uniquely qualified to do that. And there's not anybody else that can do that right now.
One of the most interesting places to watch this Sino-Russian relationship is Mongolia. And the summer before COVID, my family and I lived in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And they are watching this relationship, because if it ever gets to the point where the Russians and Chinese are so close that Moscow says to Beijing, you know what, you can have Mongolia, they're in big trouble. And so they watch it, but you can see when you're in Mongolia, Mongolia is still there, and it's still humming, because China and Russia are not that kind of relationship. It's existential for the Mongolians. So they worry about it, but they can see still that Moscow and Beijing have all these things that still divide them.
Would you like to have a final word, Heather?
Well, I would just say the other place I watch Sino-Russian cooperation is the Arctic, actually. And it is fascinating to Tom's point. China seeks a diversification strategy. Why it's so interested in the Arctic in particular is the Northern Sea route. It's a diversification strategy. If the Straits of Malacca ever are closed, they're quite interested in the protein, the fisheries, the rich fisheries. They're interested in the energy, LNG. Finally, Russia was very slow to get to liquefied natural gas, but their Arctic LNG project, a great deal of it goes towards Asian markets, and the Chinese are invested in that project and invested in infrastructure as well. They're building icebreakers. We are going to see a greater Chinese presence in the Arctic, which has some strategic implications for the U.S. So it's watching how China and Russia interact in areas of mutual interest like the Western Balkans. They compartmentalize. They actually stay out of each other's way. But we see where China's economic presence will begin to crowd out Russia's traditional presence. Serbia is the perfect example of a country which has always been part of the patronage network of Russia. But you have Serbia's leadership, President Vučić, hailing his close partnership with China. So, we need to watch how they interact in a variety of regions, and specifically understanding how they work together in the South China Sea. It will be very interesting to watch in the future.
Well, I want to thank all of you. This has been a wonderful educational experience for me today, and I hope our viewers out there will find this of interest. One thing, I'm glad we can start meeting again, and maybe we can, it won't be so long between meetings the next time. But one thing's for sure, the world is still as complicated, maybe even more so, than the last time we had one of these gatherings here at CSIS. Thank you, everyone, for TCU and for CSIS. We thank you for being with us.